Oh, thank you, my wonderful friend over here. So, welcome to the Prison University Conference. I'm so excited to be here. So when they asked me to do this, I initially thought there is much more accomplished people than I am, and so I am here standing with honor and a lot of gratitude to be able to share this space with you and to participate in such an awesome event, because as Dr. Garcia said, for many of us, education was not the path that was laid out for us early on, right? I would argue that the reality for some of us, at least for me, the path that was laid out led straight into incarceration. Because I was a prime candidate, I was kind of perfectly positioned for what we now know as that school to prison pipeline, right? I went through all of those steps. But I guess what I'm really here to say is that paths can change, and so can people, and I hope that I am a demonstration of the power of education. I also want to take a moment to recognize everybody in this room, so students, educators, mentors, family members, and those directly impacted by incarceration. I really believe that your presence here today is proof of the transformation is not only possible, but it is happening, right? Because we're standing today 300 strong as a collective of individuals that believe in the power of education and the need for change, right? That's why we're here. So, I also think that it's because of that power of education that today I'm really able to acknowledge with a lot of pride that I am a formerly incarcerated woman of color, right? And I wasn't always able to do that. I spent 16 years, as was discussed, in kind of this cycle of heroin addiction, incarceration, and survival. That was kind of my life. And I grew up around kind of systems and circumstances that told me I was never going to amount to much. And I really believed that for a long time. It became that self-fulfilling prophecy that we all talk about, right? But I can't really walk you through that journey until I kind of discuss a little bit of where I come from. So I was raised in El Centro. It's a small city in Imperial Valley, which is about 15 minutes away from the Mexicali border and about 15 minutes away from Sentinel and Calapat state prisons. It is the second poorest county in California. It also has the highest rising unhoused population currently. So as you can imagine, resources were pretty scarce and opportunities were rare. I don't want to say that they were non-existent. What I will say is that they were limited for students like me, right? And I bring that up because for a lot of students like me, gang culture provided a sense of belonging, right? It provided protection. It gave me an identity that I didn't have otherwise, and it created kind of a structure, right? Even if it was rooted in survival. And I think that's a really important thing to think about, because for many people, the gangs aren't just about the violence or crime that we always think about, right? It's so much more than that. It's about connection. Because for me, I was that kid that other parents told their kids to stay away from because of who my dad was. Standing over there with all the tattoos. And who my mom was, who's also full of tattoos, right? So I was that kid, stay away from her. But my homies didn't care because they were experiencing a lot of those same challenges. So my homeboys kept me safe from men, and my homegirls kept me safe from the stigma and the shame that I faced on a daily basis. I often tell people I was born embarrassed. Not of anything specific, I was just born embarrassed, and my neighborhood gave me a refuge from that, right? And so I think it's really important that we understand that we need to be able to offer alternatives, right? And if we want to offer those alternatives, we need to build environments that offer that same sense of safety, community, and support through education, through mentorship, through opportunity, right? And I want to be really clear, like my intent is never to glorify gang culture. What I will say is that for me as an adolescent girl with like minimal supervision, sorry Dad, he was busy. It created a safety and connection for me that I didn't otherwise have, right? So I entered the juvenile justice system at 13 years old, and by then I was probably fully strung out or addicted to heroin at the time. And from 14 to 16, I was in a lot of different placement facilities, which followed a cycle that led me through county jail, state and federal institutions. And I wish that I could say that I had some really noteworthy career in crime, right? And that's why I spent all this time in prison. But the reality is that I was just like a small town gangbanger, and most of the behaviors that I engaged in got increasingly more dangerous, and I had a lot of unhealthy choices that were probably rooted and motivated by my neighborhood initially, and kind of morphed into this loyalty to my heroin addiction. So it was nothing great that I was doing. I just found myself in these really unsafe situations, right? And when I entered that juvenile justice system at 13, the focus was never on education or recovery. It was always on punishment of a 13-year-old heroin-addicted person, right? It was structured around behavioral modification, control. It was never about learning or growth in any of those systems that I started in. Because my initial engagement with that system was due to gang affiliation, fighting, minimal school attendance, and heroin use. Yet none of those issues were ever addressed. I spent years in placement facilities where the attention was paid to anything but my future or my potential, right? And then when I was released, I was simply returned into the same environment that I had been removed from. So it was two parents struggling with opioid addiction. Again, sorry, Dad, put you on blast. Poverty, instability, and absolutely no support system for me or my parents, right? So no one ever asked me, like, what do you need, Annie? What do you need to be successful? What do you need to stay in school? Those questions were never asked. It was just assumed that I was gonna fail like everybody else. And for a long time I did that. So when we talk about that kind of cycle, right? Remove, punish, return, it really set the stage for what would become years and years of incarceration and addiction as an adult. That's where it led to, right? So I'll save you all the details of my addiction for the next 14 years, because when you think about heroin addiction, everything that you're thinking of, 10 times worse, that's what I did, and that's what I engaged in. So when I became a mother at 28, I was very much deep in my addiction. My oldest daughter was born dependent on heroin and methadone. She spent 2 months at Pomona Hospital withdrawing from heroin and methadone. And shortly after she was born, I was incarcerated again. I didn't return home until she was 4 years old that time. And by then she'd been adopted out. I was lucky my mother adopted her, but I don't think that made things any easier. If anything, it probably made things more complex. And that loss for me was extremely devastating, because I never wanted to be that mom, right? But it also became a turning point for me. And it forced me to confront not only my addiction, but it began my path to healing. It was not a linear process and it didn't happen immediately, but that's kind of where it started. So I remember meeting her for the first time at the El Monte bus station after taking a 30-hour bus ride from federal prison home. And I was so detached that I shook her hand instead of hugging her, because I didn't know any better. Like, I didn't know this kid. My students are laughing because they've heard this story. Yeah. And I just share this because I think it's so important to recognize the unique challenges that women face, right? When we return into our communities to children that we barely know sometimes, right? Because we're working within a system that really isn't set up for us. And it prioritizes family separation over family reunification. It prioritizes, the criminalization of poverty and substance use over support. And that's what I faced when I came home. And then we're expected, right, to now naturally step into this motherly role, which for me did not come automatically. And my students know I still struggle in that area, which is why my husband stays at home with the children and I work full time. But I'm also here to say that recovery and education gave me a way back, right? It created this path that didn't exist before. I wasn't good at a lot of things, but I was good at school. And it did just give me a way back to sobriety, but to dignity, to a future that I never thought was possible, and eventually reunification with my daughter. Again, it's not perfect, but she's home with me, right? I can't sign a permission slip, but she's home with me. And I want to pause there for a minute, because I also think it's important to reflect on kind of my journey into this campus, right? So when I got here, I was terrified, excited, and when I rolled at Mount SAC, I hadn't been to school since the 8th grade, with the exception of community school, or what some people refer to as probation school. Well, I was in placement, right? I had gotten my GED 3 weeks before I started the semester here, because I couldn't even do that right in prison. Like, I literally got it here at this campus. And I didn't know what a flash drive or a PowerPoint was. And it seems like it's not a big deal now, but at that time, that was kind of important. You needed to know what those things were. And I remember sitting in class at 67A. I was 4 months pregnant with my son. I was terrified, and I thought, dude, everybody knows what they're doing here. I have absolutely no clue. And I want to say I probably almost left like 10 times that day, but because I was so frozen, I just didn't go anywhere. Because I understood that I knew it was my chance. It was my chance, and my chance out, not just for me, for my family, for my husband, to bring some value and pride to my family. My poor Thea over there was like, please, somebody help her. And then I met Professor Garrett Staley. She's a faculty here at And that woman met me exactly where I was. So when I nervously waited in line after our first class, and I walked up to her and I was like, dude, I've been out of prison a year. I don't know what a flash drive or a PowerPoint is because I was gonna need those for my assignments. And I have no idea what I'm doing. She looked at me and was like, cool. And it seems like nothing profound, right? But that simple response was loaded with no judgment. It was just kindness. And she gave me the confidence to stay that day. And that was a moment, when we talk about allyship, right, that changed everything for me. She didn't see my deficits. She saw potential, and she saw what I could be. And I truly believe that this is what it looks like if we want to help transition youth and adults into and through higher education. Because it's not just about the admissions process, right? It's not just about enrollment, but it's about really creating these strong environments where students are welcomed, where they're supported, and where they're empowered, which is what I got that day. And it's also a reminder that sometimes what our students need isn't expertise or perfection, it's just compassion. And that's what I got that day. Her just saying cool to me was enough. If she had done anything more, I probably would have left. But she got me, and she met me where I was at. I was like, oh. And as somebody directly impacted by incarceration and addiction, I can also say that true allyship goes beyond the fancy policy statements, right, in these workshops. It's about showing up in small and consistent ways. Mentorship, guidance, and empathy. Because I remember experiencing a lot of fear and doubt and shame walking into various college classrooms where nobody else looked like me, where my lived experience was often invisible or misunderstood. Like sometimes it was perceived as reluctance, or I didn't want to participate, and I just didn't have the ability to do it. But I also found a lot of support. So I found support from faculty here at Mount SAC who saw potential in the sociology department, the addiction counseling department, from programs like Rising Scholars and Project Rebound, and from other students who reminded me that my lived experience gave me strength and I didn't have to view it as a weakness anymore. I didn't have to hide behind the shame of it all, right? And so I ended up receiving my associate's degree in addiction counseling here at Mount SAC. Yeah, it was great. And from there, the doors kind of kept opening. I always tell people, I stopped slamming heroin and all of a sudden my life got a little bit better. And then, who knew? And then education just opened up these doors for me. So if it wasn't for the mentorship that I got here, I wouldn't have even known about the Claremont colleges or the New Resource Scholarship. But I was encouraged to do that. And I received the New Resource Scholarship. They have a 14% acceptance rate. And I got in from Mount SAC. And I completed my bachelor's degree there in sociology. And along the way, I happened to run into this gentleman named Michael Griggs. And he was, and at the time he was, I think, the outreach coordinator for Project Rebound, but he was also a Pitzer alum. And I was lucky enough to be able to work with him side by side as we coordinated this justice education conference at the Claremont colleges, which had never been done before from system impacted folks, right? So it was me and 6 gentlemen as we worked together to make this happen. But it didn't end there for him. This man has made himself available at every step. So he answers my calls, he answers my emails, and he patiently helped me navigate the MSW application process at Cal State San Bernardino. He's written very strong emails to DOR to ensure that I got services and funding for my MSW. And just the other day, we had text, and he was like, I'm here to support you if you need help getting into a PhD program. And so this is what I'm talking about when it's consistent all the way through, right? He has never been a gatekeeper of information. He continues to encourage me consistently that I belong. And I truly, truly believe that his support has been instrumental in not only my acceptance to Cal State San Bernardino, but my upcoming graduation in May. Like, that man has been foundational. And in that same time, I met this gentleman named Brad Tharp, and he was a career center faculty at Pitzer College. And this man met with me every single week for 2 months to refine my personal statement and all of my graduate school applications, right? And I tell that story because at the end, those meetings were no longer about writing. They were about building my confidence. They were about telling my story and him consistently reminding me that my lived experience mattered because I had never thought it did before. Again, I always thought it was something I had to hide. Don't tell nobody your dad's a heroin addict. Don't tell nobody your mom struggles. Don't tell nobody, right? That shame. And that, again, that restorative justice and that allyship that we talk about, it recognizes that re-entry, it doesn't end at the gate. It continues as we walk on the campuses that may not feel made for us, but we still belong there, right? Absolutely. And today, fast forward, I'm very proud to be in long-term recovery. Again, not a linear process. I am an educator, yes, me, an educator of amazing students. I feel so lucky every day to share that space with my students. They're amazing and they come with a wealth of information, and I just love, love, love being with them. I have the privilege of working alongside Mr. Joe Lewis and Kevin. Kevin is my fellow monster. He knows what I'm talking about. Carlos and the amazing team at Rising Scholars, where we continue to support you. Yes, Rising Scholars. And we continue to support people from our community who are navigating all the complexities that come with re-entry and higher education, because I know how hard that journey is and how transformational it can be if you have somebody to walk alongside you, right? Because I was lucky enough to find that here at Mount SAC. Garrett Staley, the woman that I talked about, she has maintained her presence in my life. She was a sounding board when I'm like, dude, I'm a state and federal felon. I can't do what you do. And she was like, no, you're wrong. I didn't even know it was possible until I met that woman here. And she has, over time, kind of transitioned from my professor to a mentor. And she continues to empower me through every step of my educational journey. And today I'm proud to say she's my colleague, and I get to work side by side with the woman that helped me start my journey at this same campus. Yes. And then I also wanted to touch a little bit on kind of throughout my journey some of the barriers, right, that I faced. And I started to realize that they weren't personal failures, they were systemic, as we all know, right? So when we talk about these admission processes that fail to accommodate returning citizens, when we talk about financial aid forms that don't consider my incarceration history, right? And programs that continue to unsee my lived experience and don't see it as a strength. So when I think about some of those barriers that are systemic, I think one of the most prevalent for me was the digital divide. And so we talk a lot about that, right? I always joke with my students, but I'm totally serious when I say that I learned how to email in federal prison, and it was only because it was cheaper than phones. At that time, I think it was like $2 for 40 core links or something. Do you remember, Kevin? Something like that, right? And I was never one of those inmates that wanted a whole lot of interaction with the outside world. I just needed a quick way to ask my mom for money so I could get my 12 songs a day on my MP3 player back then. And so that was really kind of the limit of my digital education before I re-entered society. So when I got to Pitzer College, Mount SAC had prepared me academically. I was set in that realm. But at that time, we were still handing in papers. When I got to Pitzer, it was so vastly different. I did not know how to use some of those academic platforms. And it wasn't because of a lack of intelligence or potential, right? It was because of lack of digital skill. I just didn't know how to do it. That's why I'm still using paper right now, because I still struggle, right? I don't have a fancy, right? And so I consistently felt overwhelmed. And it wasn't just the technical skills that were missing for me. It was kind of that shame that I carried that kept me from asking for help. Part of it was cultural, I think. Part of it was pride. Part of it was fear. Whatever it was, I literally didn't have the ability to ask for help. I didn't have the ability to raise my hand. And that's why in my class, I don't make my students raise their hand. I'm like, just call it out, because that would happen to me. I would just, because I just couldn't do it. And so in a lot of those early days, I sat in these classrooms where everyone looked so young, and they sounded so smart, and they wrote so well, and I always felt like I didn't belong. And I think that it took me years to realize what I perceived as my deficiencies were really just a lack of opportunity, and I think that's always really important to focus on, right? Because folks like me are often made to believe we're not smart enough, we're not intelligent enough, when in fact, writing, speaking, and even regurgitating material confidently are skills that are taught, right? It's not a sign of innate intellect. It doesn't mean I'm smarter. I just learned that skill. And that has been really helpful for me to be mindful of that, to better support myself, but also system-impacted students, right? Because in my opinion, I think that digital divide is a modern form of marginalization. It's one that disproportionately affects people like me. It disproportionately affects those returning home from prison or who've been excluded from technology for years or decades. It just makes reintegration harder. From filling out applications online to applying for jobs or even accessing telehealth or just reaching out to your professor. Everything requires digital fluency. And I would argue about 80% of the students that I serve have been impacted in some way by the criminal justice system. And without a doubt, digital literacy remains one of the most significant challenges they face. But when I was incarcerated, no one prepared me for that, right? There were no classes to help me catch up. And I think things are shifting, but at the time, that's what it was. That's what I had. So I left digitally illiterate, and like many others, I had to teach myself as I went along because I didn't want to ask for help. And that may not be the case for anybody. I know a lot of people who come home and are totally fluent in all things digital. That was not the case for me, right? That was just definitely not the case for me. And so when we talk about policy and research, I always invite people to kind of ponder on how can we recreate policies and rewrite them to actively include people returning from incarceration. How can we, yeah, absolutely. How can research center their voices, but not as subject as experts, right? Because I don't need anybody to tell my story. If I'm given the platform, I can do it just fine on my own. I don't need anybody to speak for me, and I can tell you better than anyone, but I need to be successful. And so we are the experts, right? Absolutely. Out there because this is who I think of when I wrote this part. There are plenty of days when I feel like I'm not doing enough, right? But then I have to remind myself that everybody has a different role in this work. So I always think about like boots on the floor and being on the ground and fighting with community organizations and rallying for change in the streets because that's what Dawn does. She's out there in Washington. But I have to remember, I'm a mother of 4 children under 14. I'm still a full-time student until May, and I'm an educator. So right now my role is to serve, to support the reentry population, and to be the best educator I can be for my students, and most importantly, remove any barriers when I can, even if it means just changing the due date for one of my students. Even though I say I'm not going to, I do it. I'm like, I don't take late work, and I'm like, okay. My work is showing up consistently for rising scholars whenever they ask me to, and continuing to collaborate on ways we can better support our system-impacted students. My work is serving on task force here at Mount SAC to make higher education more accessible for currently and formerly incarcerated individuals. And my role includes representing what's possible for my students and being a mirror for them, because I always tell my students, you are me and I am you, right? Because some of them may not see themselves in higher education yet. And I always argue, like, I just know a little bit about this topic more than you, but you probably know a million things way better than I do. And another role is being a role model for my children and being an active parent in a way that my parents couldn't do for me, right? So breaking that cycle of poverty, substance use, and incarceration. And so I always say, well, those tasks may not be what I envisioned when I said I'm gonna be an agent of change. I understand that resilience isn't just about personal perseverance. It's about contributing consistently in ways that we can, and knowing that together our collective efforts build lasting impact, right? Danny's another one that I'm always like, dude, I'm so amazed by the work that you do. I want to be out there with you. Oh, but I have 4 kids at home. So I'm there with you in spirit. And my story isn't some anomaly, right? There's a lot of us in here that have stories of resilience. And it's not about individual grit or pulling myself up by my bootstraps. It's really about having communities like this and institutions like Mount SAC that nurture us while we rebuild our lives. Because this is where it started from here. And I also want to say when we're talking about sustainability in this work, it also means creating systems of support that don't depend on one professor, that don't depend on one advocate or one lucky break, that are baked into the culture and fabric of higher education itself, which is what Dr. Garcia is making happen here. So we're talking about Project Rebound, we're talking about Rising Scholars, Underground Scholars Core, right? These are all examples of how the work can be institutionalized. So that pathways from prison to university are not the exception, but the expectation. Because as we all know, education is the single most effective intervention for reducing recidivism. Did you know at a master's level, you have a 2% chance of going back? I'm not going back, right? And again, I want to pose a couple of more questions about collective responsibility, right? So I invite you to reflect on this personally, and also when we're having dialogue with each other. How do we continue to dismantle the systemic barriers? What does that look like things that are preventing, people from accessing education after incarceration? And how do we kind of honor, their experiences, expertise, and how do we build institutions where students coming home from prison are welcome, supported, and celebrated? And I think we're doing it here, but how do we extend it farther, right, outside of our reach? And this, I also want to speak directly to those of you who are students or prospective students today. I just want you to know that it's not unheard of if you feel out of place sometimes. I know that some of us carry shame, fear, and self-doubt. I want you to know that I not only felt that, but I still feel it all the time, especially when I'm in spaces where my lived experience is so vastly different from everybody around me. And that's in a lot of spaces. I go to these academic conferences and I'm like, oh boy, they have no clue. So me and Kevin have glasses and that fools everybody. They would never know, and then we walk outside and we're like, oh boy. But I want you to know that you are exactly where you belong. You are, sorry, I'm getting overwhelmed with emotion because it's just so, I just want you guys to know that you belong here and you're exactly where you need to be. Your lived experience is not something that you need to hide. It's absolutely a source of strength, resilience, and I believe that it's wisdom that the world so desperately needs. I want you to know that you're not defined by the worst mistake you've ever made or the hardest circumstance you've survived, because for many of us, that's exactly what we did. We survived circumstances that were dealt, right? But you are defined by your ability to rise, your ability to choose growth, your ability to choose healing, and to choose education. And I also want to speak to the educators, mentors, any policy makers, and allies here today. I want you to know that your work matters more than you know. That sometimes it's even the smallest act of encouragement, a smile, an extra meeting, a willingness to listen, or removing a single barrier that can change everything. It did for me. I told you for Garrett Staley, because those simple words cool, and that was enough for me to come back the very next week. Because I want us to remember that for a lot of our students, the barriers are not just internal, they're absolutely structural, right? And so together we need to work to break those barriers down, because we still have academic spaces that carry stigma and judgment about who belongs here, who should be here, who deserves to be here, and it's our job to break those down. And it's not out of charity, but because I firmly believe that education is a fundamental human right, and because our campuses and communities are stronger when they include voices and talents of those who have been system impacted. But before I close, I want to say one more thing. I want to reflect on a reality that we often kind of don't talk about, right? And it's the social barriers that don't end at graduation. So I'm an example of how that continues even after degrees are earned and job offers are made. So after earning my first 2 degrees and completing years of service in behavioral health and advocacy, I was hired as a full-time faculty here at Mount SAC based on my experience. My education and my qualifications, and it was a dream job, and I was like, oh my gosh. And then shortly after I was hired, I was notified that the offer was being withdrawn due to Education Code 87405, which prohibits the employment of individuals with past controlled substance convictions. And so I have a colorful history, and some of that includes sales cases and importation of narcotics into the United States, so, it is what it is. And neither the college nor I knew how to navigate it at first, because there was no written outline. There was no standard protocol for what to do next, because it had never happened. I'm lucky that I serve an institution that decided to keep that conversation open. They didn't shut that door on me, not that kept that conversation open. And I always say, for ththose of you who've been involved in substance use, we can become compulsive. And so I became compulsive about this education code, and I found out that there were exceptions and there were subdivisions to this education code, and individuals could still be employed if they had applied or received a certificate of rehabilitation, or if their convictions had been dismissed under the 1203.4 Penal Code. And Mount SAC HR was lovely enough to give me roughly 60 days to make that happen. They didn't take my job offer, but they didn't keep actively looking for a replacement either. They just kind of put it on hold, which is unheard of at the time, right? And in that time, I was able to get 6 felonies dismissed. I was able to obtain my certificate of rehabilitation and secure approval from the parole board to seek a pardon. And ultimately, because of the Board of Trustees and Dr. Garcia, my appointment was reinstated. And I would argue that it was a very lengthy and stressful process, not just for me, but probably for the Mount SAC HR team and everyone involved. And I share this because we often talk about education, right, as the solution or the great equalizer. But I think we also need to make sure there are clear supportive employment pathways for our students too, right, on the other side of education. We need written policies, we need transparent procedures, and we need to make sure that the doors we're working so hard to break down and kick through don't get slammed shut by outdated statutes or unclear hiring practices. Because when education opens a door, we have a responsibility to make sure that it stays open, right? All the way through employment, stability, and long-term successes. And finally, recovery and education really made it possible for me to reunify with my daughter, which was my long-term goal, right? To rebuild my family. I've had 3 children since, we just kept having more. And really create a life that I've never dreamed of. And it was a ripple effect, because it wasn't just me, it wasn't just my husband, it wasn't just my dad, it was my baby daddy, his girlfriend, her child. It was just on and on, this ripple effect of education, right? So I stand here today not just as a speaker, but as living proof that transformation is real and that it happens when we meet people with compassion, opportunity, and belief. And I firmly really believe that through allyship, thoughtful policy, meaningful research, and resilient communities, which is what we have here, we can build sustainable pathways from prison to university. Thank you.